How have we fared? Well, to assess the performance, we are joined by Eric Klinenberg. He is a professor at New York University, and he's written a book titled Fighting for Air, The Battle to Control America's Media. Welcome.
Nice to be here.
We just had this report, of course, that was showing how people in Australia were hoarding food, hoarding medication, even though there's not a single confirmed case of H1N1 there. So what does that say about the job that the media has done so far covering this story?
Well, I want to know how widespread that kind of behavior is. I haven't heard many cases like that here in New York City, but clearly we have a media right now that is really hyping up the significance of this event. It's being reported as a pandemic, which it is, but that just means it's spread very fast and very far. What seems to be the case right now is not nearly as lethal as many people in the media and frankly many health experts thought it might be.
There tends to be a sense where you have a story like this that breaks. Health news is very important to the public, so you have the almost insatiable appetite on the part of the public to want to know more.
That's right.
But then they reach their fill and that's it, I'm over it.
Well, I think that has something to do with what's happened to the flu pandemic itself. But you're absolutely right. This is a very tough case for a reporter to cover because you have to reach what your other reporter called the balance between reporting about the story, getting out news that there's a significant and dangerous health event happening right now and potentially a pandemic situation, but then also not scaring the public. And it's at a moment like this, a potential crisis, that journalists become public servants, and they're the ones who translate crucial information from the medical world, from the policy world, to the public. And much of the reporting I thought was clear and sober, but there were many cases where the balance tipped and we got into fear-mongering that I think was quite destructive, actually.
Can you cite specific cases where you thought it really went over the top?
Well, there are several. A couple that popped out to me were CNN reporting two things. One, that tens of millions of people could die if this pandemic was not stopped. And another where a journalist who was at a press conference with the DHS at the White House kept pushing the health officer to answer the question of whether this was a bioterrorist threat. Was this the origin of this in bioterrorism? And despite a couple of denials, when she later did her report, she said, well, the White House is saying it's not a bioterrorist attack, but it's very early in the story. Now, there was no reason whatsoever for us to be worrying about this being a bioterrorist attack, so that was an egregious case.
It's sort of open speculation.
That's right, and I personally faced a remarkable situation, which is that I do a lot of work on the sociology of disasters in media, so I got a lot of calls from reporters, and in one case, I heard from someone who wanted to report on the panic in the United States. And I responded by saying, look, I'm happy to speak with you, but the truth is that Americans are not panicking. In fact, decades of social science research tell us that we very rarely panic during crises. Look at the streets of New York City, where I walk to work every day. I'm not seeing people wearing masks. The subways are full. Very few people didn't ride in the subways. We're looking at nothing like a panic situation. In fact, New York Magazine recently did a poll and said that there are more people in New York City who hadn't heard about swine flu than there were people who were terrified of it.
Well, when you told this reporter that there was not a panic situation that you could observe, what was the response?
Well, I was hoping that would result in a very sober story, but unfortunately the story was a report about a panic pandemic in the United States, and it featured things like images of a mushroom cloud, an insect that looked very scary, a scientist in a lab coat, and a historical account of that said that Americans have a tendency to panic and kind of become hysterical during cases like this. And the examples they used were things like buying bomb shelters during the Cold War and buying duct tape after September 11th and during the anthrax scare. And the truth was, those were cases where the government made very kind of foolish recommendations to the public.
And there's been conflicting statements coming from the government in this particular instance.
Absolutely. But what the historical record shows, in fact, is that American people and people in most parts of the world, in fact, react to these kinds of crises in reasonably cautious ways. We absolutely do not panic most of the time. And so we have this image of the Independence Day scene from the movies, but that doesn't happen in real life.
Well, do you think the media should do different next time? How should we have changed?
I hope that the media does, and I think one of the things that we have to be very cautious about is exaggerating the threat. You want to be clear when there's an unfolding health situation that you're not certain on what the outcome will be, but you certainly want to caution against the kinds of overreactions like we saw in Australia. This is not a time to be hoarding food. This is not a time to be hoarding drugs. If you do that, there are all sorts of dangerous outcomes that you can get. One of them is that people will stop trusting journalists on whom we all rely during crises. And it's really important for the media as an institution to maintain its credibility because they're going to be the mediators between the government and the people when the next crisis happens.
That erosion of trust is obviously a great concern, especially when we take on the role of public servant in a crisis like that.
I think that's right. And listen, there are a lot of people in the United States who have become quite skeptical about the Department of Homeland Security, for instance, because they thought that the color-coded alerts and the duct tapes that came after September 11th just made it an untrustworthy organization, and now we kind of laugh about them. You really don't want that to happen to journalists as well, because we need some place to go to get reliable information. And the truth is, most of us are not listening to the press conferences directly. We don't read the technical reports produced by scientists and by policy organizations. So unless we have journalists playing that role, I think we really lack the kind of authority that we'll need to get useful recommendations.
I'm afraid we're going to leave it there. Eric Klinenberg, thank you very much for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.